pleasure for me to welcome one of our own postdoctoral fellows at the Sahel Research Institute, Dr. Adib Bencherif, who is also affiliated with the University of Quebec in Montreal, as well as the University of Montreal. He got his MA at Laval University, his PhD in political science at University of Ottawa. He's interested in security issues, political violence in the Sahel, and focuses a lot on narratives and representations of Tuareg political elites in primarily Mali and Niger. He's published in Terrorism and Political Violence, Canadian Journal of African Studies, Politique Africaine. So we're really looking forward to hearing from what is, at least for right now, one of our own. So with that, I will switch over to you, Adib, and let me turn on your screen sharing here.
Yes, I'm trying to share the PowerPoint.
Okay, you should be able to now.
Yes, awesome. So just being sure that, I think now everyone can see it, I hope.
Yes, I can see it. Yeah.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. It's a very early paper, and I'm still working on it, but it's not even the main my main research interest. It's more something who popped up when I was in the field and became an object of study. So there's pure contingency in this exploration because of what happened in my fieldwork in Mali, and I'm going to explain to you how it happened. So basically, I'm exploring more in this presentation the role of Tuareg women in the last northern Malian conflict. Just as a reminder, the Tuareg communities are known as nomadic communities living in North Africa and West Africa, mainly in Algeria, Libya, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Of course, they are not only nomadic communities. You have people who are more semi-nomads or sedentary people, even living in big cities like Bamako and Niamey. They were like the main people that I met were in the capitals. So basically, they are like evolving in this space. And in Mali and Niger, they had more or less tensions with the central authorities in these two states. They did a synchronic armed rebellion in the 90s. And to sum up it, to say it in a very simple terms, because of lack of political and economic inclusion in these two countries, they were like starting an armed rebellion. They had different peace agreements in the 90s. And now the situation is more or less peaceful, let's say, in Niger, but not in Mali, when the country experienced a last Tuareg rebellion in 2012, with a peace agreement in 2015, but the violence is more or less still going on. So the rebels, the Tuareg rebels in Mali were asking, were seeking the autonomy or the independence of what they called the Azawad. The Azawad is more or less the northern Mali in this map, and that's more or less very. They were like asking the independence. Now, after the peace agreement, they're like more asking for a cultural autonomy and political autonomy. So, so here we are. However, after the peace agreement, something happened, and the narratives of my interlocutors in Mali were repeating that multiple times, that the Tuareg women were like more rebellious than the Tuareg men. And they were saying that because they did some protests in 2012 after the beginning of the Tuareg rebellion. They did also protests in 2014, and more, and what was bothering them, it was like their protests after the peace agreement in 2015. So they did few protests in 2015 and 2016, and no one among the political elites understood why they were still protesting. And that's more or less the time of my fieldwork. And that's how this question became interesting for me to explore. So after the peace agreement in 2015, you have like this narrative about women. Les femmes Tuareg sont devenues incontrôlables. The Tuareg women are now becoming uncontrollable. So this sentence was from a high official in charge of the Malian reconciliation in 2016. We can say that it's very androcentric, but more than that, it was repeated so many times by the interlocutors, this more or less this sentence, that it became something. The narratives around the Tuareg women were not like depicting them as victims, but more as rebellious figures. And so the whole question is about why. How is the rebellion of Tuareg women after the peace agreement revealing layers of symbolic violence? Is more or less the macro question here. And what are the roles played by the Tuareg women in the different rebellions, and why were they protesting after the peace agreement in 2015? The methodology that I'm using in this paper, it's more or less like the methodology of my dissertation. I did fieldwork of 8 months in Mali and Niger between 2016 and 2017 in Mali and Niger for the dissertation, focusing on the narratives of Tuareg political elites. I met many men, of course, because in terms of elected people, you have more men than women. The representatives of the armed groups are more men, of the civil society too, and it's revealing also the difficulty to be part of the political arena for women, even Tuareg women, and I will develop a little bit more about that later. But I had a very androcentric bias at the very beginning of my research, but not because I wanted to it, because I had like these interlocutors as my immediate interlocutors, and mainly men. But they were repeating so many times this sentence that I was, okay, I definitely need to meet Tuareg women to have an answer to this question, why they're like defining them in a such way. But it was quite hard to establish the first few contacts because they were fearing the foreigner, or at least my intention and why I was like exploring this topic, what was like my true goal. You have like this suspicion easily raised about you being part of like the intelligence services, or mukhabarat in my case, because of my background as Algerian. So they were like identifying me as plausibly an element of the mukhabarat, and they didn't want to talk. And these concerns were was quite important with the Tuareg women. So unable to speak with them. So pure contingency, one of my key brokers was developing a project, a research project on the role of women in the resolution of the Malian conflict. And he asked me to help him to implement a methodological design, a research method. And I helped him, but the deal was, I'm helping you to do your research, and I'm not asking you anything, but I want to meet this woman for my own research. So basically it was a win-win deal, quite improvised at that time, but it was my way to have access to this woman. I interviewed more or less 10 women by myself in Bamako, and few interviews were conducted by my broker, the key broker, and his team. And of course, we kept, we were like talking through social media, because they went in rural area in Gao and Kidal, and I was not able to be with them. I kept only 5 interviews because many other interviews were not systematic, or at least they didn't transcript it correctly, and the data are like too weak to be used. So it's also a challenge when we are exploring these very sensitive topics. And I did also some interviews with NGOs and associations focusing on women empowerment in Mali, and local actresses, which can be defined, who can be defined as like somehow political elites or like opinion leaders. So before exploring the last conflict and the role of Tuareg women in the last conflict, it's important to explore the evolution of their role in their societies. And what I observed at the very beginning in the literature, it's a confusion between, or even in our narrative when we are talking about Tuareg and Berber communities, we are thinking that it's about matriarchy. We're thinking that the women have the power in their societies, like and it's a very, the issue here is that a lot of scholars and even people on the ground are like making a form of confusion between matriarchy and matrilineality. Matrilineality means more like the system in which descent is traced through the mother or and maternal ancestors. The mythology is around like women figures, but it doesn't mean that they have the power in the society, the political power. So that's the first thing to raise. And the Tuareg people that I met in Mali and Niger are going to use these narratives coming from outside also and establish a confusion between these two elements in their own representation of women. So I think this like issue of contamination of our own representations on other societies is a key normative issue here. When we're talking about Tuareg women and the women in the Berber communities. You have also this the division that I'm very present in the literature, and Clodo Awad is the most famous scholar who developed on this cosmogony of the Tuareg world. And she's dividing the world into space, the Tuareg world into space, the private and the outside. The private space is more or less defined through the term Ehan, which means like the tent. And it's like the private space of the family, of the subgroup, of the unit, the subunit of the tribe. And you have the outside. The outside can be defined as Tenere, the desert, or Essouf, which means the dangerous outside, the wild one. And of course, when you're referring to Ehan, like the tent, you're referring to the woman. It's the space of the woman. And Essouf, it's the space of men. And you're going to associate some features to these two different spaces. So it's a very binary vision of representing women and men. And however, they consider that women are still playing a big role, but they are limited in this private space. They are more like to localized in this private space. And this expression that a lot of people used on the ground, for me, express like this form of ambiguity when we like talking about Tuareg women. They're considered as influent and discreet political advisors. So they're not really loud. They're not going to be very visible. They are discreet. We are going to hear them, but at the same time, we're asking them like discretion. So that's interesting. And women and men were using these expressions when they were talking about the role of Tuareg women in politics. In Kidal, for like the people in Kidal, a lot of them were like talking about a form of triangle. And one said it in a very systematic way when he was explaining me the role of women. And he told me in this triangle, you're finding the Amenokal, the leader of our communities, of the our region of the Adar. You have the women who have also a political power, but it's more about educating the communities and telling to the men if like their behavior are good or not. So they are more the morality and the dignity in societies are going to be defined and confirmed by women in their words. It can be in lyrics, for example, in songs, or in the everyday life. And you have also Qadi ulama, who are like more the juridical power in the societies. So it's a caricatural way of representing the poor in their societies, but at the same time, this metaphor came quite often when the Tuareg from Kidal were talking. So it's an interesting one, and it's revealing the representation of the poor. A Tuareg woman said this sentence, it's a metaphorical one, and some people were like, when I was using this expression, other people, men and women, were laughing at it and confirming that is their way of thinking. So, ce que la tresse dit la nuit, la barbe le fait le jour. What the braid says at night, the bird does by day. It's more or less the translation. So it's reinforcing against this cosmogony of the inside and the outside, and the influence of the very huge influence of the inside to the outside world, but in a discrete way through the private sphere. And we can see a lot of normative concerns coming with that. But in their society, they're representing it positively. That's like the time of the tradition. And in our tradition, when they were talking, they were saying, in our tradition, the role of women is that. And it was something that they were proud, because they were saying the role of women, they have better, a huge influence in our society, a bigger one than in all other communities, and they are more respected than other communities. And sometimes you have like people from other communities talking about, in a very impressed way, about this mythology of women, of Tuareg women, having like a huge influence in their societies and a huge respect. So that's the tradition. However, of course, you have multiple layers of meaning. My first and main concern is like to say that in the cosmogony that I was more or less developing right now, we're more focusing on the upper social classes, on the women who are aristocrats, and the relation between Imrad, for example, the vassals in the tributary groups, or like the women, the black Tuareg women, are going to have a very different relation with their men, and we tend to harmonize or the relation between men and women in the Tuareg world without thinking the social classes. And Dragani or like Rasmussen demonstrated that you need to consider multiple factors: the social classes, the hierarchy, more or less the hierarchy existing in the Tuareg world, and also the more or less the access to education, at least like Western education here, and the clash with the tradition happening with that, the generational clashes, which is like more or less interconnected with the previous point. And also urban versus rural area concerns, and the role of the religion also is going to play a role. And I will invite you to explore the text of Dragani, Amalia Dragani, in which she's detailing in a festival in northern Niger the different variables playing a role in the performance of a poet, a woman poet, in this festival, and it's absolutely a marvelous example about the role of these different variables to explain the relation between men and women, to avoid the caricature when we're talking about this topic. So basically, multiple layers of meaning And based on that, when we are talking about women in the private sphere and like the traditional way of understanding them, it's a way to prevent them to be competitive actresses in the political arena. And I observed it with men when I was asking questions about the role of women in the political arena and why they were not like many to be elected and all of that, considering how they were talking about the influence of women. And they were very defensive about that and accusing me of having a form of agenda. And it's true that it's very hard for them to be elected. Few of them acknowledged it and gave the example of Nina Wallet Intalu. Nina Wallet Intalu more or less won the election of the mayor in Kidal in the 90s through an alliance with with another party, but she won. And Lecoq and Schrijver explained that the chiefdom and the central authority more or less helped the member of the family of the chiefdom to become the mayor and not her. They more or less had an informal deal with Nina, telling her that she can't have like the mayor to become the new one elected. And it was because of the conservative values and the Islam that telling that the women can't be like elected in these societies and all of that. For Lecoq and Schrijver, these new norms played an important role in this deal and the fact that Nina couldn't become the mayor. However, when I interviewed people, they were more talking about the rivalry between Imrad and the chiefdom, because the political party allying themselves with Nina and helping her to win were like Imrad from the CNID, a specific party, and the chiefdom were like against them, of course, and trying to avoid to have like Imrad, vassal tribe, to become like the one helping the competitive become mayor. So you have like all these different narratives around why Nina Wallet Intalu didn't become like the mayor, but at the end, it's staying something very important when you were exchanging with Tuareg women. For them, it's an illustration of how it's hard for women to become political representatives in northern Mali. And the same for economic activities. They are framed through a form of folklore for me, and also for Tikura. She's like demonstrating through touristic activities in northern Niger and a little bit in northern Mali that women are framed through specific kind of activities, like making some jewelries or like some artisanal products, but not being like for example, the managers of hostels or anything like that. So it's like framing them again and reinforcing a disparity, an economic disparity between them and the men in their societies by limiting them in the what they call the traditional role, the private sphere. And you have also a form of rivalries now with hosts and singers for festivals and cultural events in Bamako. And you have like this very strong rivalries between influential women. And it's somehow the neoliberalism talking. They were talking about this rivalry because everyone wants to have access to the funds. So again, multiple layers of meaning when you need to think like the role of women in their societies. So to explore the role in the previous rebellions, mainly in the 90s, because we have more data about it, and they were more organized than in the 60s, which was more an improvised rebellion in the 60s. So in the 90s, they were singing, obviously, and having some poems that they were saying to the fighters to encourage them to fight. They were like organizing some they were raising some funds for the fighters, notably in the southern part of Algeria. In Taman Rasset, you had a lot of Tuareg women who are refugees and doing that there. They were doing also logistics for the fighters, for the food and different, for the different aspects of the organization of the rebellions, and also playing the role of informers, spies, more or less. However, a key important thing to keep in mind is the trauma of the exactions in the 1963, the revolt, the first Tuareg rebellion, which is more a revolt in the 1963. And it's still a trauma right now, because when the women are talking about the violence that the Malian state did, they're going to refer to this period of time. And this quote is for me a key one, because they were talking about this issue multiple times. So I wrote it in French, but I can translate it. Les femmes à Kidal étaient contre l'accord d'Alger car elles avaient peur de revoir les militaires du Sud et qu'ils allaient venir les persécuter, les violer comme avant. So basically the translation is like the women in Kidal were against the peace agreement of Algiers in 2015 because they were fearing to see the militaries come from the south coming back in Kidal, and that they were going to persecute, to rape them like before. Before you have the Tuareg women who are talking about their grandmothers and the previous generations, about what they experienced, and they're fearing like to live what they experienced. So you have a very strong trauma, and they were repeating this reference about this transformative event for them in their relation with the Malian state. We're talking a lot about like this traumatic event when we're talking, broadly speaking, about the relation between Tuareg and the Malian state, but here you have like the violence, more specifically against Tuareg women and their trauma, and it's going to fuel the conflict. So the Tuareg women in the last rebellion, they were key actresses to mobilize their communities to support the MNLA, which is like the new Tuareg armed group in 2012. And they were using familial bonds and also reference to masculinity. It happened also in Niger when the non-fighters are not men. With such narrative, and because they have like the role of telling the good behavior in societies, when you like adding this meaning of in the rebellion that you're using your statue as men if you're not fighting, it's helping to mobilize more. And the young members of the MNLA were perfectly aware of the importance of using Tuareg women in the region of Kidal to convince their parents, their uncles, as they said, and their fathers to come back and to start a new conflict against the state, because a lot of them were against it at the beginning in 2011, where they're starting to organize themselves. And it's something that we tend to underestimate. But they were also, and we talked a lot in media about that, because the media coverage was about that, and it was again kind of the mythology around the Tuareg women figure, about their opposition to the jihadist groups, because of the, they were like asking them to wear more clothes, to not go outside, to wear veils, to not go in jeans, as they said. And some women were like telling me, I was saying to this young man that they had like the age of my son, to let me do whatever I want, and I was wearing this kind of pants and I didn't care about them. But you have like this very weird relation of the body, which is like very used to say the freedom of the Tuareg woman. I mean, it's an important one, but we overemphasize the opposition of Tuareg women against what they experienced in 2012 with the jihadist groups on that. and we perhaps tend to forget their agency. And it's also a thing in 2014 because of the very strong narrative that we have on this Berber women, and it's not happening only when we're talking about Tuareg, but also when we're talking about North Africa and the Berber women. So in 2014, basically the prime minister tried to come in Kidal, and even if everyone was like telling him to not go there, the international mediators and also people from the communities, because the conflict was still going on and the process was following its path, and they were almost reaching an agreement between the different parties, but the tensions were still very important between the armed groups and the Malian state. But he went there to say that he was a strong man, and because of to reaffirm the Malian sovereignty. And it was a bad move, and somehow militaries were like coming more or less with him. So everyone was fearing that the Malian state, or like the president and prime minister, were trying to regain the power and the control on Kidal, which were controlled by more the armed groups. And everyone was informed by it among the international actors and the local key actors, and they were repeating them to not go there because it's not the right time, and that they were already organizing themselves against eventually the militaries coming in Kidal, but they did it and they clashed. And one international mediator told me in a very ironical way that all the armed groups were very fragmented in 2014, but because of this move of the prime minister, they found a way to recreate a kind of solidarity between all these armed groups, and they decided to fight together against the army and the paramilitary group of Agamu. So they recreated a form of union against them when they did this visit, the visit of the prime minister. The protest started with women and young people protesting and hitting like the prime minister and his men with like stones when they arrived there. So that's like how it started. And you have a lot of narratives about women being used by the Iforas. So basically the women of this community, about the women in Kidal, don't have any agency. They were used by their men to fight against the prime minister. And they were instrumentalized. Once again, you have like this kind of narratives denying the agency of women. And it happened quite a lot when I was conducting interviews with men. And this narrative is a narrative of a man talking. And the rebellion, so that's the most interesting part, the kind of what I call the rebellion of women post-Tuareg rebellion, so the rebellion after the rebellion. So after the peace agreement in 2015, all the actors were concerned about the protest of Tuareg women and their strong opposition against the agreement. And when I talked with Tuareg women who played the role of mediators in 2016, they were telling me Tuareg women were opposed, not like opposed to be opposed, they were opposed to many elements. To the Malian state, because of what I said, the traumatic event of 1963, which is more important for them than when we were talking only to men, when it's more emotional in terms of what they experienced, and they are more or less the people who are keeping the stories of the group. They are one of the main actors keeping the story of the group and the memory of the group. So they're going to be more opposed, or inclined to be more opposed against the Malian states in Kidal. You have also the peace, they were opposed to the peace agreement. So basically they were militating for years for the independence of the Azawad. They were like really sensible, really mobilized, using all these rhetorics. And it's the young rebels of 2012 who asked them to mobilize all these rhetorics and to be part of it. And now they're telling them that they don't have the peace, they have a peace agreement, they don't have a state called Azawad. So they were against this peace agreement because no one consulted them when they negotiated and signed the peace agreement. So they were not even informed. Some of them were not even, didn't know any content of the peace agreement. Some women told me that people from their family, women, thought that Azawad was now independent. So it's revealing how much all these elites negotiating in Algiers and in Bamako and all of that didn't reach their people and the women, and they didn't do a pedagogical work with them, despite knowing what kind of narratives existed from 2012, 2015. And it's revealing the elitist bias of this negotiation. And they were against the Tuareg men, who didn't consult them at all. And in their societies, you need to consult them, as they said, the discrete political advisors role that they have, and they were not at all consulted. So because of that, they were against the agreement. And they at the same time, some tensions rise between Gatia and the HCUA. Some women from both sides were like calling for conflicts on social media. And it's interesting to notice that they were both Imrad. So we tend to say Gatia versus HCUA, it's Imrad versus Iforas, two different tribes. But some Imrad were siding with the group of the Gatia, and some Imrad were siding with like the group of the Iforas, and they were more or less from the same category or the same community, and they were clashing against each other in social media and more or less reinforcing the conflicts between the two groups, even if the leaders were trying to decrease the tensions at that time. So it's interesting that they were not following at all the same temporalities. Finally, you had multiple incidents between women in Menaka, and it's about redistribution of food and different funds. And they were clashing, even if the armed groups were not clashing at that time. So you had work of mediation in 2016 conducted by two key actresses, I mean, as leaders of this different mediation. Mainly in Kidal, I'm thinking about what happened in the region of Kidal here. Keltoum Walet Mastar and Nina Walet Intalu were the two key figures here. And what's interesting is like the narrative that they used and the way they are thinking these two figures. When I met Keltoum Walet Mastar, Keltoum is known to be a famous artist in Mali. They are she's kind of representing the culture of Tuareg world, and she knows how to address Western audience. She knows how to play with all the references that we have in mind when we're thinking about Tuareg, notably the blue indigo color, when we're thinking, and she painted so many beautiful painting about using this color like to reinforce this narrative about the blue man of the desert. So, and she used like the traditional role of Tuareg women to become an important actor on the ground. Basically, she's telling, I need to be a political discreet advisor because it's a traditional role of our society. We are like the women are like telling the dignity of the society, the morality and the memories of the society. We are the storytellers of our society, and we are protecting the culture. basically, with this narrative, she can explain why she's an important figure in terms of as an artist in this world. But at the same time, she's reinforcing this narrative of the traditional role of women, which needs to be very limited to types of work. And she played the role of mediators, and she was playing a fantastic work by using terms in Tamashek to explain the importance of discussing in the Tuareg world. She created a lot of social media groups to help to decrease the tensions between the societies, because now it's more about WhatsApp exchanges and voice memo, which can increase the conflict and is playing a role in the and we tend to underestimate it, but it's like the now the playing a role in starting the conflict or fueling the conflict. In 90s, it was like more groups like Tuareg Women playing like songs calling for like the violence and the conflict, but it's not anymore. Now it's more about like WhatsApp and social media. And she's a key influencer somehow for peace. But at the same time, she's framing the role of women in a very specific way. So positive and negative effects coming with this character. In the case of Nina Wallet-Intalu, she conducted another mediation, and in her case, what was interesting is that she was biased. She gave more funds to the MNLA and not the other groups. So because she was part of the MNLA before, she gave more funds to a specific group. So she was not impartial at the very beginning. What was funny is that some Tuareg women saw her coming back in Kidal, and they were like, you told us that if anyone is signing a peace agreement with the Malian state, you will continue the rebellion in your case. And now you are part of a commission of reconciliation, and you're now even a minister, because she became a minister of the artisanat, so minister of tourism and the artisanat in Mali. So she sounds very pragmatic and able to change completely her narrative, because she was one of the key figures of the rebellion. Everyone was talking about her as the rebel woman figure of the MNLA, and personifying the rebellion of the society. And now she's a minister inside the Malian, the Malian government. So the Tuareg women were discussing with her about like this contradiction, and she had like a difficult time at the very beginning when she went there in Kidal in 2016, but they forgave her, and she became, let's say, an important player, giving them funds to offer them a form of redistribution to accept the peace agreement. But this contradiction of Nina is interesting, because a lot of women were like forgiving her, or at least explaining it by saying, well, for her, it was a form of revenge. I mean, she was like becoming a key figure of the rebellion because she wanted to be part, to have a job and to have revenge against the 90s when she was elected, and they didn't let her become the mayor. So now she became a rebel, and she obtained through strength and through this conflict a job as a minister. And some of them said and added that she helped the community somehow, not only through the redistribution, but because in her office, you can find a lot of Tuareg, young Tuareg, who are now young advisors or like senior officials. And it's a way to have more inclusion of Tuareg inside the Tuareg government and the Tuareg administration. It's true, but at the same time, she nominated people from her tribe, the Idnen community. So as you can see, multiple layers of meaning, and she when you're thinking about her path, perhaps she helped her community, but perhaps through a tribal lens, and also by thinking carefully about her career too. So it's an ambiguous and a very complicated figure here. And these two figures played a lot with what Bayard called the strategy of extraversion to become key brokers in Mali. But I'm not sure if they are key brokers to help the empowerment of women in their society. So that's like my concern, my normative concern there. Furthermore, there's like another strong bias when we're talking about this woman, even in the field, when they were talking about this woman of Kidal, like still rebellious figures. So it's not about all the Tuareg women, it's more about the Tuareg women in Kidal. And when we're saying that, it's also a bias because we need to differentiate and not mix up the region with the city. All women in Kidal did not encourage violence or tensions. So you have like this very mythic narrative about this rebellious figure, but it's not at all the case. It's some of them were like protesting publicly, and it's true that it's a new thing, not happening in the 90s, like public protests of women inside the world, but it's not about the whole region. It's about the city of Kidal and the legacy of the traumatic events of the 1960s. In other political arenas, such as the region of Thessalit or more or less the localities of Thessalit, women were not like signing in the same way and not protesting in the same way as the women in Kidal. And I want to explore more this middle posture happening in this community called the Irreganaten. So the Irreganaten are known to be a middle, more or less a middle, a community with an ambiguous posture. They are not, or at least an ambiguous position in the societies. They are not aristocrats. Are they not referred as Imouchar? And they are not referred as Imrad, strictly speaking, the vassals. They are in between. So they have very interesting position because some of them sided with the Imrad, the vassals, during the conflict, and some of them sided with the Iforas. So it's a community keeping a form of dialogue with the different positions of the communities in the region. They are interesting figure to play the role of mediators, and many women were playing this role informally. Even if we don't know about that, you had a lot of peace mediators, peace brokers, more or less, in Thessalit to help like re-establish a dialogue between Imrad and Iforas in northern Mali, but also in the Kidal region. Some of them were militating for the Tuareg cause and even joined, for example, the MNLA or the Ashiriya, so rebel groups, but not for the rebellion, strictly speaking, or for an opposition against the Malian state, but more to defend the Tuareg cause. So they were more or less obliged to join these groups, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that they were sharing the same narrative or sharing the same view. They're respecting a lot the Tuareg women from Kidal and what they experienced in the past, but at the same time, they're not for what they're asking, this violence, and that they were asking in 2015, 2016, or at least the radical narratives that they had in 2015 and 2016. And they were like trying to differentiate themselves and to say that they have their own voices. And we didn't talk at all about the plurality of voices among women at that time. So it reinforces the biases that we had around this strong narrative of the rebellious figure of women in northern Mali. So I'm going to finish with that. The expectation of the women, because when we are exploring this kind of topics, it's interesting to see what are the expectation of all the women that I met, or with those I exchanged, and what they wanted from the state and the peace agreements, and so their own vision of politics and economic and political inclusion. So they talked about economic support with like all these projects about microfunding, but more than in the 90s. They were asking more, so they were clear about that. That was not enough. But it was not only about microfunding. They were asking professional training, even in security forces. They wanted like to be integrated in the army or like in the police. So they were really caring about this aspect, a dimension completely often forgot by men. Huh? When I was exchanging with them, and they were surprised by this demand when I was discussing with them. The inclusion also of the young women in the state institutions, they asking like what they considered as well-educated women who went to the universities and all of that to be part of like the administration and all of that. They're not asking them to be to live the same experience of inclusion as them. So these narratives were like repeated multiple times, and it's interesting because some authors talk about the rigidity and the conservative norms of the Tuareg women in Kidal, fearing to lose their culture if their daughters are going to schools and leaving their milieu and somehow leaving their identity and losing the links with their parents. But when I exchanged with all these women and based on the few interviews conducted also in rural area, they were repeating that multiple times. So I think it's a very interesting point, and perhaps and plausibly, let's say, revealing that the norms are changing in the milieu. I liked also what an informant said, that to explain us la politique, to explain us what's happening in all these political parties, how to be leaders. And because they are not really aware of how to become engaged or to become a militant in politics. And there's an effort of pedagogy to do in all these regions to help them to understand how to invest la politique, the politics of the, but inside the institutions and the political parties and all of that. And men have an important role in their societies to play, because they are like keeping them aside, because they need to stay in the private sphere. So okay to say that the women are like playing an important role in their societies, but men tend also to try to avoid them in the public space. So that's a very contradictory and paradoxical narrative when you're exchanging with people from the ground on this topic. They were asking justice against jihadist groups in the region, and even when they are Tuareg. So you have this, all of them were not asking to have them prosecuted, but some of them asked, and that's an interesting thing to say. And they were also, all of them asking for the reconciliation process to address what happened in 1960s. Like that was an important thing. And I'm sure Alioun is going to agree with me. And dialogue between communities and women, not only dialogue between communities, but also dialogue between Tuareg women and between women in general. And an important opinion leader in Bamako said that the women can learn from each other, from the different communities, and somehow some narratives helping Tuareg women to play a more influential role in their societies can be used by other societies, by other communities through an open dialogue. And so it was like a feminist concern by this opinion leader, and I think it's a good way to end the presentation. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Adib. So we now have about 35 minutes for question and answer and comment. So please raise your hand in Zoom and I'll call on you. First question is from BS. I'm not sure who that is. That's an obscure screen name. So go ahead.
BS stands
Ben.
for not bullshit, but Benjamin Svarlas.
Okay,
So Adib, I enjoyed your paper, and I could say many things. One remark I would make is that the two women you talk about in some ways are so unrepresentative. And I wonder if there is a way to try to get insight into how other women, other Tuareg women are thinking. And it's striking that there really hasn't been a lot written about Tuareg women from a social science perspective compared to places elsewhere in the region. So, you know, Niger, Mauritania. And I wonder if it would be useful to think comparatively, because arguably the way women, Tuareg women, act socially, politically, economically is not unlike, you know, the Arabic-speaking Mauritanian women, women in northern Niger. And I wonder if you are able yet to think comparatively. And I think that it would be important to do so when you know, work on this paper for publication, because probably those will be, you know, people who've done that kind of work might be some of your main interlocutors. So that's what I would say. It's more a comment than a question.
Thank you a lot, Ben. I completely agree. It's still at the early stage, but the comparative dimension is very important to keep in mind, notably with Mauritania. In the case of Niger, I was using more the literature on Tuareg women, but yeah, definitely I need like to be able to engage with the broad literature. And for like the two women, you're absolutely right. It will be probably a subsection in the article talking about these Tuareg key brokers, as a woman, and playing like our like brokers are more or less like the people representing their communities for the outsiders, but they are not representing that much their societies, and they have their own interests and how they're playing politics. So they have to have a subsection as them through their strategy of extraversion, and after that talking once more about the all the other voices that I have in terms of data. But I was impressed by the fact that they were trying to represent women and at the same time following their own agenda with so many layers of meaning that I wanted to put perhaps the emphasis of them because of their role of also peace mediators in 2016. And there's another figure like Al-Shabi Komaiga, which I found absolutely fascinating, and which is not really representing also the Tuareg woman, but is one of our key interlocutor because she's member of the parliament. So that was like more like the form of critique of the elitist perspective, and that's it. But yeah, you were absolutely right. I need to have more voices in my paper.
Could I do a quick follow-up? I mean, it's so interesting if you think about Mauritania. I mean, Mauritania has had, you know, Hassaniya-speaking women foreign ministers who come from. There was a woman who came from a place very close to, you know, not so far from Timbuktu, across the border in Mauritania. And I mean, historically, women there have had similar roles as Tuareg women. And I wonder if there's something distinctive about the Tuareg rebellion, which has led to this sort of public repression of Tuareg women's public roles that you don't see in Mauritania. So yeah, so I'm just sort of thinking off the top of my head.
But that's an interesting point. I'm keeping that for my exploration. As you know it, we don't have a lot of data, except of course the works of Amalia Dragani or Rasmussen, who developed about it. But we didn't really address their role in politics, and I think I will need to navigate through some hypotheses and comparisons. But thank you a lot, Ben, for your feedback.
Thank you, Ben. We have a question from Renata Serra now.
Hi, I didn't know I was second, but thanks so much, Adib, really interesting. And my question actually was going in the same direction as that of Ben. So how does this case study contribute to the wider literature on women's roles in conflict situations or strife, social strifes? But more, one dimension I think is very interesting is that a lot of women's movement have been cross-cutting. So if we take cases in West Africa, notably in Liberia, for instance, women's really allied across divides, and notably in that case, Muslim and Christian women allied in order to, bring peace or bring a discourse that was different from the one that men had. So I was wondering whether you had, you could speak, and you alluded to at this point, at your very last point, the dialogue across different groups, across divides, the potential for it to exist in the words that you have heard by the women, but also drawing from secondary literature. Is there anything that you can say in that direction? Thinking of social movements, but they cut across, as I said, divides.
Thank you, Renata. It's my whole dilemma about how to frame the paper. To have a little review about the role of women in post-conflict setting and in their respective social movements, and to have a way to compare or to say what's the processes that I was able to see, which is not which not the same in other cases. You gave the example of Liberia. I think there's a paper in African Affairs talking about how they were able to have some responsibilities in a post-conflict setting, and that they were able to become politically included in the arena. So yes, it's one of the key challenges of this paper to be able to talk to this in a transversal way to the literature. And I'm still brainstorming. My main concern was about the voices of women and the agency, but I still need to frame it. Perhaps the post-conflict setting can be a way to establish links with other cases.
And maybe you have a second paper there. I mean, it's even good practice not to put too much in there, but if you think there is a huge literature, and Ben is right, a lot of case studies, a lot of literature on other contexts, but very little from the one you're drawing from. So it could be a second product.
Thank you, Renata. I mean, it's very useful, and I'm going to continue to leave this dilemma to see how I'm going to write. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thanks, Renata. Next question we have from Amadou Sow. Go ahead, Amadou. Amadou, can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Oh, okay, very good. Okay, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Adib, so much for what you're doing and your research. I'm Malian, so just to let you know. And then it's a place that I know very well, so it's okay. I don't know. I mean, knowing those different voices of women, like we know that's the different Tuareg groups, like in Malian community, so they were not speaking the same language. So how did you, in your research, how did you happen to reconcile the different voices? I mean, in regard vis-a-vis the rebellion, because we know the rebellion is not the whole Tuareg rebellion, it's just a community rebellion that's trying to, group like a different, forces from here and there just to make it a big thing out of it. So we also know what's the reason behind, all of the forces behind this rebellion.
Yeah, you're right. It's about like the contingency, the key broker. So basically, through my, I can say it, one of my main key brokers was part of like the community, the Irreganaten community. And because of that, I was able to reach Imrad from Gatia and also people from Ashiria and MNLA because of their ambiguous posture in the different groups. And that's how I obtained the very first meeting. And after that, I built on it. Of course, my data are very fragmented. I don't have the whole puzzle. And I was like trying to have the story through the protests of these Tuareg women, starting from that, like the protest after the peace agreement, and trying to see all the narratives that I was able to obtain starting from there. Yeah. So it's a way to have back the voices of women in the literature, but it will be a very first attempt. It will be like a limited attempt, I mean.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Amadou. I'm going to go to Susan Rasmussen. Go ahead, Susan. Oh. Susan just vanished from the screen there. So we'll see if she comes back.
I was not aware that she was present, but that's good.
Matthew, go ahead. Matthew Flom.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for the talk. Enjoyed it. Yeah, I just had two quick questions about, I think I saw a couple notes where you said that most of the women were protesting the extremists or jihadists, but I was just wondering if you encountered any support of Mujao and Akim and Ansar Dine or any other extremist groups. And then I was also wondering if you could clarify, you said the kind of ambiguous position of Nina Wallet in terms of going from a rebel. I think she's been a rebel since like the 80s in terms of looking for independence for Azawad and then becoming a government official. But I just think that's a bit harsh and unfair because I think a lot of the Tuaregs had to make concessions given the defeat by the French military. So I think a lot of the Tuareg signed the peace agreement and have, joined pro-military groups like the Gatia and had a lot of, shifts in their, which I think was part of the, strategic stuff. So I was just wondering if it's a bit unfair to kind of criticize her position in that way and just what you think about that.
Okay, thank you for your questions. For like the women supporting jihadist groups, I mean, no one of them told me that they were supporting jihadist groups. It doesn't mean that perhaps at some periods of time they were doing it for their own survival. One actress somehow said it in a very indirect way, that it was for protecting her family. So it's hard for me to tell you something about because they were not going to say that. The people were more siding with the government, more or less, the Gatia or the MNLA, so and the Ashiria. So they were like identifying themselves through these 4 categories. About Nina Waletintalu, it was more the words of the woman talking about Nina than my own words. So that was like the narratives, and it was divided in a kind of a sequence, starting by saying, look at her own contradiction, but okay, we're forgiving her because of what she didn't obtain in the 90s. You're right that it was a little bit unfair for to be to focus too much on Nina, but it was the case when I was talking with men, trying to depict her too much through her ambition and her opportunism when they were doing the same thing. But when it's about like the woman talking from the specific region of Kidal, and some of them siding with the MNLA, and when Nina was their leaders, and still in the MNLA, and saying that it's more about like the internal contradiction of her rhetoric, of her being part of them, and changing her political view. But you're absolutely right that like the majority of men in the peace agreement, and more than that, were like very opportunistic, and even some of them were very radical for the independence, like Musa Aksharatman in the MNLA. He became a true defender of like the Malian state after that. So it's a transversal critique, absolutely, and yes.
Oh, thanks. That clears it up a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Do we have anyone else with a question or comment? I don't see any hands up at the moment. Okay. Alioune, go ahead. Alioune So.
Yes, thanks, Adib, for the paper. It is true, like what Ben mentioned, that you've selected 2. How can I say? You use the word ambivalent figures in the northern Mali politics. Just I mean, Keltoum Ouellet, who was also at some point in the early 90s the producer of Tinariwen, when they had this sort of very aggressive discourse against the Malian state, who now becomes the spokesperson for peace in the north. I mean, reflect how complicated the politics in the regions are. But I just wanted to ask you if you happen to meet voices of other women than Tuareg women in the region, and if you happen to contrast what these other voices were saying about the conflict. I mean, I guess that most of the discussion about the conflict in the Tuareg area were not just animated by the Tuareg women. I'm thinking about Aisha Tassise, for instance. And did you contrast some of these different discourses on the conflict, on the region, or not at all?
Thank you, Alioune. Yes, I gave them some importance in the presentation, but as like more like players between the inside and the outside. But you're absolutely right about the ambivalent figure of Keltoum, and she was proud of saying that she was like the producer of Tinariwen in the 90s. So she said it when we were like exchanging. About other people, it was very hard for me to have access of a very harsh and emotional discourse. So somehow the women exchanging with me were like part of the peace mediation, or were accepting to meet me because I was with my key broker, and revealing me that they were still defending the Azawad or such thing. But I only had like moments when I saw a very radical discourse coming from some women siding with the MNLA, for example, or the Gatia, and at that time when the 2 groups were like trying to change their relation, and to decrease the tensions between them. So it was challenging to talk with them, because when I was asking them after that to have like discussions, they were like dodging, because it was like more informal words that they were sharing with me when I was like going in a specific house, asking questions to someone else, and then I was exposed to other discourses. So except in a very safe meetings for them, because of my key brokers or because of the data I collected in Kidal and in Gao, I was not able to have like many voices. So I'm still trying to work on some data that they collected for me. And because I was not there, the issue is that it was more, it's hard like to interpret what they collected. So that's my answer.
Thanks.
All right, we have about 15 minutes left. Does anyone else have a comment or question for Adib? Okay, I'm going to go back to Amadou Sow.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, what I'm seeing in all of this, like what he has said so far, and based on all of the comments, I'm thinking like as a political leadership, I mean, expert. So it's like everybody's kind of fighting for themselves, their personal interests. Like what we said, like who get what, how, and how much, and at what cost. So that's what we are seeing. Like people are cutting deals. I mean, and not sometimes even for the community, they're cutting deals for themselves, because that's the rebellion most of the time have been, I mean, focusing on, because they've been manipulated by other forces that have like a, I mean, strong interest in this rebellion. But those little key players, I mean, also are fighting for their own benefits. Even recently in Mali, all of those key figures like were claiming the independence of the so-called Azawad. That's not really historical or geographical or like something really tangible. I mean, in Malian history or even in African history. So, but we see today all of those people now are part of the, if they're now part of the transitional government, they are in the part of the transitional, I mean, assembly. I mean, they are part of the government anyway. So, which didn't make any sense. So, but still, it's good. Like Malians still can talk to each other, but we see that the French not like making that easy for Malian to just sit down on the table and talk between them. So they just want the world to get involved in it and solve like a Malian issue when it's a Malian place just to sit down on the table and discuss their own differences, and for the world to really help them to go in that direction. But what we are seeing today is like the French are trying, with a partner to impose what they want to impose on Malian, like a solution to Mali, which is another problem in the future. But anyway, it's great, it's good. Still, experts are working on it, trying to find solution and help Mali government, Malian people, the Tuaregs, anybody who is like affected directly or indirectly by this so-called rebellion in Mali.
Thank you a lot. I mean, I'm going to connect with like the question of Alion to be sure that I answered him. The people I met, mainly when I'm talking about Tuareg women, I'm talking about the Irreganaten in Tessalit, Kidal, Gao. That's like the main localities of the. They are living in rural area in these regions, or they are from these regions, and that I met them in Bamako, and they are very sedentary people. Or some of them are like back and forth, or where they were refugees. I talked with some Kelansar too, from Timbuktu, and that's more or less like the communities, the women that I exchange with them when I'm talking about the Tuareg women. Just to be sure that I was like giving you more details about like the kind of interviews that I conducted. And the informal discussions were about these same groups. For like your question, Mr. So, it's always like challenging to see to try to see. It's the famous debate about greed versus grievance. Like, are they like? Is it just about greed, or are they really believing on their like ideology or the things they're trying to obtain for their community? And my vision is that it's a little bit of both of them, and that of course when you're with more the elites, the instrumental vision is going to be more important. But I think it's the two elements are playing a role. And for the foreign, the role of foreign actors, it's interesting that you were talking about notably the French security forces, because when I exchanged with the Tuareg women, they were like all complaining about the international agencies not doing enough. And the tone was completely different when it was like in the cities, the people I met, and those in rural area. That's at least one trend that I can be sure about what I'm saying. It's that they're like really negatively depicting them, representing them, and they don't know what they're like doing in the field and for the region in northern Mali. And the narratives were a little bit different in cities, because they were talking about some projects developed and the role of UN Women. But it's interesting that in rural area they were not seeing any consequence, any effects of the international interventions. All these agencies, at least in their narratives, they were really radical in their narratives. So that's a very key difference between the people I met in cities and those who gave us their like testimonies and living in rural areas.
Okay, I see that Susan Rasmussen is back, made it back into the room. So I'm going to see if she still has a question. Susan, do you still have a question? You can go ahead.
Unmute. Yes, my apologies. I lost the connection, but now I'm returned. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Yes, very interesting talk. I had a question, please, concerning the relationships in all of this identity and these mediations between the Tuareg women of different class backgrounds. For example, you very briefly mentioned the so-called Black Tuareg, which I realize is a rather, at least as I understand it, it's a little bit more complicated than, you know, a clear-cut ethnic difference. Has there been much cross dialogue between, say, the Imoujar, the women of Imoujar background in northern Mali, and women of other backgrounds, for example, former subordinates in the old pre-colonial system?
Wow, that's a very, thank you for your question. It's a hard one because I just obtained data through my broker, and of course I can talk about more the Tessalit and the Kidal region to talk about like these relations with community. So I can say that Irreganaten were like playing the role between the Imrad, between Imrad and Imrad, and between Imrad and Iforas, and like the statue that they're referring to, like the aristocrats in Majoran. But in Menaka, I have like some narratives, but it's very confusing, and it makes. I collected some narratives saying that people were like siding, you know, with the Gatien and the MSA, and some people from the Imageren were like against Temrid, and they were like fighting against each other in this incident in 2016. And you have all different narratives. It's about the redistribution of funds. I don't know if after that they reestablish a dialogue or so directly. So for the MENACA region, I don't want to talk too much about it because I had just few fragmented data and I don't want to interpret. But in the Kidal region, I can say that in these three categories, I can see a dialogue. But for the Black women, Tuareg Black women in Kidal region, we have less, and they were not like appearing in their discussions. I mean, they are like, and they are absent from my interviews. That's a strong bias of my interviews. I didn't meet any Tuareg Black women, at least for interviews. I met them like in an informal way in Niger, but they didn't really talk about any sensitive topics at that time. So I don't want to add this dimension about like the Black Tuareg women because I don't master it. Sorry.
Yes, I think, you know, it's a very complicated situation. And in my own comparative research, you know, I've worked for many years in Niger, primarily in the Aïr region, but also I conducted 2 research projects in northern Mali just before the outbreak of the 2012 rebellion. But my impression was that the situation is a little different in each country and even perhaps in different regions because, for example, where I worked in the Aïr, there's been extensive intermarriage between you know, Tamashek speakers of different class backgrounds. Whereas in Mali, my impression was that tends to be less the case, but I'm wondering, are there any changes in that, you know, because of the need to unite and the needs to mediate, you know, and I'm just wondering, you know, about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that I was asking myself all the time and I didn't have the answer. But I read your work, so I know to what you're referring to too. But for like the marriages in Niger, you're absolutely right. The people like mixing from different societies and eventually from social classes or even from ethnic groups. I mean, you have like a trend, like it's... and some specific group like the Kelfede, Keleway, more the Keleway, that
yes,
like that it's more mixed for many reasons, notably economic reasons. But in Mali, you had like this narrative, and I'm writing a paper about it, but it's more about narco smuggling, and that. Now, marrying a narco smuggler is a form of achievement. And
really,
Kidal were repeating so many times this sentence, even Tuareg women, in even when I was not even asking this question. So the matrimonial strategies changed. I think we can say that there's like this trend coming with narco smuggling, and the writing of Schill, Judith Schill and Ines Cole a few years ago, I think.
Oh, yes.
In 1 decade, some changes happen to the norms. I'm not sure if it's going to create some matrimonial alliances between Black women or Black men and Tuareg Black men and Tuareg Black women with like a white Tuareg in northern Mali. Because of narco smuggling, but they were using a lot of this reference when they were talking about Imrad versus Imageren, and the fact that they were marrying each other and like messing like with all the matrimonial classic alliances, and it's eventually caused by the narco smuggling. And so I think we have perhaps some changes because of this new relation with the money coming from the narco smuggling. And that's an explanation that I think it's happening in northern Mali, like definitely.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Susan. Well, we've reached 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Hour and a half went by very quickly. Thanks, Adib, once again for bringing some of your research to all of us. And thanks to everyone who came out today. And this is our last Baraza of this semester. Next week on Friday, we'll have our annual Carter Conference. You can check our website or social media for those details, and you're welcome to attend, and we'll resume these back again Friday afternoons in January. Thanks, everyone.